Thank you. So, this is a report in today's paper. It says, we are yet to make a mark in science globally. Regrets, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Now, this isn't the first time such an article is coming out. It's been coming out year after year. So, yes, we need to reform our education system. But before that, the first question would be, what should we reform? Should we reform school education or higher education? Now, I believe that when you're targeting a problem, you first have to hit it at its roots. Now, it is in schools that students build the foundations for the rest of their education career. So, the obvious path to follow would be to reform school education. So, say you were to go to a group of school teachers and you ask them, so, how do we reform the school education system? What's wrong with it now? And so the cry goes up immediately. They say, oh, students aren't interested in learning. They just want to memorize the textbook, rote learning. But what was it about the Indian education system that fostered this culture of rote learning? There were two things. Firstly, it's an old relic. 30 years ago, in the education system, if you had a student and he could recite 100 facts, he was considered a genius. Because 30 years ago, to get those 100 facts, you had to read 100 books. But in today's internet age, such ideas are completely obsolete. Because if you want 100 facts, open up Google, you got them all before you. I'm not saying that facts are not important. I'm saying that intricate details are completely unimportant if a student doesn't understand the underlying idea. And isn't that what education is supposed to be about? Understanding, not memorizing. Now, the second problem is we seem to have very rigid syllabi. Why is this so? Now, if you were to go into a very rural school, you'd probably meet teachers that aren't very qualified to teach their students. So now, obviously, you can't leave the education of a child to someone that isn't really qualified to give them that education. So what do? You give them a textbook and you say, look, everything you need to teach them is in this textbook. If it's not in the textbook, you don't need to teach it. But if it's there, make them memorize it. And another thing is, the people that correct a student's answer papers, again, might not be qualified to do that. They might not even be teachers in the first place. I actually know teachers that would give their final exam answer sheets to their children to correct. So you have to give them answer keys. And you say, look, if it's in the answer key, and if it's in the answer paper, you give them marks. Otherwise, you don't give them any marks. So you see what the system has created. It's given you a rigid textbook, and it's given you a rigid answer key. So what all students do is, oh look, if I memorize what's there in the textbook, and if I reproduce it here, I'm going to get marks. If I think originally and creatively, and write what I understand, I might not get marks, because maybe that's not what's there in the answer paper. So what happens is, an atmosphere is developed, you see, because since the answers are right in front of you, all the answers you need to know are right there in the textbook, they're right there. So, the idea that, you probably must be stupid if you get anything wrong, because the answer is right in front of you. So what happens is, this tends to create an atmosphere of fear. Students are afraid of being wrong. They're afraid of ridicule from their teacher and from their classmates. So what happens is, they're unwilling to take the risks that are required in an educational system. When you learn something, you need to take risks. Alright, you're not always sure that this is right. You try to understand it, maybe it's wrong. So you try again and you keep trying until you actually get it right. Now, Ken Robinson had once said in a TED talk a couple of years ago, he said, you never come up with anything original if you aren't prepared to be wrong. Now this is a very profound statement, because our education system has created such an atmosphere of fear that being wrong was something that was stigmatized completely. So what happens is, students now don't want to venture into new areas. They don't want to take risks. They're quite content within the confines of their own technique. So how do we reform the system? What's an ideal system? An ideal system, you have a classroom where learning is based on curiosity rather than fear, where originality and creativity is given precedence, over simply memorizing facts and grades. So Charles Lee Peter, he was a British author, and a couple of years ago he said education systems can be classified into two. You have your McDonald's model and you have the Chinese restaurant model. Now, in the McDonald's model stresses on uniformity. Because no matter where in the world you go to a McDonald's, you can expect the same thing, right? No matter where in the world I walk into a McDonald's and I say, I want a McVeggie burger, I'm going to get I'm going to get the one slice of cheese, no, thank you very much, that's very organized. You can expect the same thing. But you can't do that in education. There he advocated what was called the Chinese restaurant. Because very rarely you have a large chain of Chinese restaurants. So no matter where in the world you walk into a Chinese restaurant, you know it's a Chinese restaurant because of the kind of food they serve, the smell, the ambience. But very rarely will you find two Chinese restaurants that are exactly the same because the local culture seeps into their food. It seeps into the buildings. That's what you need in education. You need the education to be adapted to the local climate. Now, take a hypothetical example. Assume you have this village, it's a rural village, and most of the children seem to be dropping out of school because they're moving into farming. Now, if you try and teach these children, if you try and teach them about the kings and queens of England, they're not going to be interested. The British monarchy has no relevance to them. So they're simply going to drop out. So what do? You teach them things that actually interest them. If they're dropping out of school to move into farming, you teach them to farm, you teach them about soil types, you teach them about irrigation, you teach them about fertilizers. You simply can't teach a child who's wondering where his next meal is coming from, about what goes on in a land he probably may never see. And the reason that this happens, the reason these dropouts happen is something called a payoff time. Now, when you think of a traditional education model, the payoff may come many years later. So if you have traditional education, by the time you see the returns, it's about, say, 10 years down the line. And for these children, that's a little bit too long. They're not willing to wait that long, that's why they drop out. So what you do is you reduce their payoff time. You teach them to farm. Result, they learn something. They stay in school. You give them some sort of an education. Now I want to tell you two stories. The first was in a small village called Tilonia in Rajasthan. Now there's a man by the name of Bankar Roy, and he set up what was called a barefoot college. Now unlike most traditional college educations, in the barefoot college you don't get a diploma or a degree, or you don't have an engineering syllabus. He taught the villagers what they felt was important. He taught them how to measure their land. He taught them how to vote. He taught them what they would do if they were arrested. You see, because to them, that's what education means. Education is not a static term. Just because these villagers don't know who Shakespeare is and what he wrote doesn't mean they're uneducated. We need Chinese restaurants. We need education to adapt. The second one is called the hole in the wall. Professor Sugata Misra was the chief scientist at NIIT. And he went to this small village called Madantusi near Lucknow. And he said, and the villagers told him, look, none of us here know any English. So what he did was he took a computer and he literally made a hole in the wall. He put the computer inside and then he left. He came back 2 months later and then he finds all the village children, they're gathered, they're clustered around this computer. And they're playing games, they're playing music, they're recording it. So he goes up to them in astonishment and he says, look, this computer is written completely in English. And apparently none of you were taught any English. How do you know how to use it? So the children look at him and say, you left us a computer that spoke only in English, so we learned English. You see what's amazing about this story? Children that apparently could not learn English on their own, they did it. They were given the time. They were in an atmosphere free of fear. They weren't afraid to be wrong. They kept going. They tried again and again until they got things right. They figured it out. The point I'm trying to stress here is that children don't always need to be pushed to be educated. They were driven completely by curiosity. This was something that he called minimally invasive education. You didn't have teachers or parents to push them through. He let them do it on their own. Now, one point I noted about this was, if he had done this in a school, if he'd taken this computer and put it inside a school where the students didn't know what a computer was, but nonetheless a school. If he'd put it in there, the first day, you would have all the students clustered around the computer, and you would have a teacher in front, and the teacher would say, look, this is a computer, it's very expensive. None of you know how it works, so we don't want you to touch it, because you might break it. The teacher would have said something about the computer, all the students would have nodded along. End result being no one understands anything. And apparently that's what they do in schools anyway. So what would the ideal system be? You'd have a classroom where students learn from discussions and debate. They didn't have a chapter. The teacher didn't walk into class and say, okay, look, today we do section 10.1. She posed a question. She'd walk in and say, look, how do you think light moves? And they'd discuss, they'd debate, they'd put forward their ideas. And more importantly, they'd be actual ideas that had some sort of applicability. And we also need to build a system that tolerates mistakes. Because you need to understand that in the education process, making mistakes is an inherent and crucial part. If you're not willing to take mistakes, you're never going to learn. And this has been said so often that it's become a cliche. A couple of years ago, I had gone to the Olympiads. Before that, they'd taken all the members of Team India and we'd been paraded around all the labs looking at all the equipment. So on day one, we walk into this lab, there's all this fancy equipment all around. So we file up against the wall. And then the professor walks in and he says, look, why are all of you standing there? The equipment is over here. No one says anything. So he goes up to the equipment and he says, look, you can use it. Again, now we're looking at each other surprised, what does this man actually want us to touch that expensive equipment? So what he does is he walks up to the control panel. Okay, all the controls for the equipment are over the counter. And he says, I understand that this is expensive. And then he takes all his hands and he pushes down all the buttons. And he said, look, it didn't explode yet. It's still there. And he said, if you break it, we'll figure out how to fix it. But if you stand over there, you're not going to learn anything. So calm down, push a few buttons, see what works. That's the kind of attitude that we need to develop in our classrooms. An attitude that's, an atmosphere that's free from fear. You see, because the world recognizes creativity. The world no longer recognizes people that can simply spew out facts. You have a computer to do that. A computer can do it better. We need people that can do things that a computer can't do. We need people that are able to think creatively. We need people to innovate. And that's what TED celebrates. TED celebrates human ingenuity. If you notice, all the speakers before me are extremely creative people. All of them do things that computers simply can't do. Apart from being creative, we also need to think of applications for what we learn. I mean, a lot of the time in schools now, in colleges, schools, you learn all about Fourier transformation, you learn multiple integrals. But if you ask them to apply it somewhere, a lot of the students simply can't do it. They say, okay, look, you can solve exercise 10.1 to 10.6, okay. But if you ask them to apply one of those things in the real world, they can't do it. So we need to figure out some way. We need to bring creativity and originality back into the classroom. Because right now, with the atmosphere of fear that we seem to have created, any student that was in the least creative has the system beat it out of them completely. So what's an easy way to do that? Say 2 hours a week, you get young students, and for 2 hours a week, you let them think creatively. You say, okay, look, sit down, 2 hours, do whatever you want. Come up with ideas of anything. Okay, let them come up with stupid ideas. Let them say, look, here's a 3-tip pencil, here's a solar power bullock cart. How we use it, we think about later. But let them think of something. So, every student is probably going to have 100 ridiculous ideas. But at the end of that, they're going to have this one good idea. And in a country of 1.2 billion people, if everybody had one good idea, that's 1.2 billion good ideas. And that is what would take this country forward. Thank you very much.